How Supermax isolation breaks the human mind. Imagine being locked inside a concrete box the size of your bathroom. No sunlight, no touch, no human voice for weeks, sometimes months. Your food slides through a narrow slot in the door. Your toilet sits a few feet from where you sleep. And slowly, your own mind begins to turn against you. This isn't fiction. This is real life inside America's most secure prisons, the Supermax facilities built to contain the most dangerous individuals on Earth. But there's a question that's impossible to ignore. At what point does maximum security become psychological torture? A 2020 study published in Frontiers in Psychiatry found that prolonged isolation produces severe psychological harm, including depression, hallucinations, and cognitive breakdown. Human Rights Watch called it a silent mental collapse, one concrete cell at a time. And according to a 2023 analysis by the National Alliance on Mental Illness, suicide rates in solitary confinement are 78% higher than in the general prison population. Breaking a person's mind may have become the price of keeping society safe. This documentary takes you deep inside the walls of Supermax isolation and into the fragile human mind it slowly dismantles. If you're intrigued by the hidden world inside ADX Florence, make sure to hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to follow this journey through the most isolated prison in America. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes. Viewer discretion is advised. The box. Every Supermax prison has its official name, ADX Florence, Pelican Bay, Tams. But inside, inmates have another name for it, the box. In this world, prisoners spend 22 to 24 hours a day completely alone. They live in silence. They eat alone. They think alone. Their only movement is within a space barely large enough to stretch their arms. Concrete walls swallow every sound. The fluorescent lights hum endlessly, a constant reminder that night and day no longer mean anything. A single slot in the door delivers food, mail, and the occasional word from a guard. According to a research grant by the National Institute of Justice, this level of isolation does more than alter behavior. It begins to rewire the brain. Inmates experience memory loss, confusion, and an inability to tell dreams from reality. Their sense of identity fades until even the sound of their own voice feels unfamiliar. One former inmate described it simply. You start talking to yourself. Then the walls start answering back. The Harvard Law Review calls this the psychology of cruelty, punishment that doesn't end when the door locks. It begins there. The longer a person stays in isolation, the more irreversible the damage becomes. How exactly does the human brain react to such isolation? And what happens when it's pushed past its breaking point? The science of solitary. Supermax isolation doesn't just confine the body, it begins to reshape the brain. Modern neuroscience reveals that prolonged sensory deprivation alters the brain's structure, function, and chemistry in measurable ways. The Frontiers in Psychiatry, 2020, meta-analysis examined dozens of studies across multiple prison systems. Its findings were consistent. Isolation triggers severe disturbances in mood regulation, perception, and cognitive function. Neuroimaging research shows reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for reasoning, decision-making, and impulse control. When stimulation disappears, the brain begins to underperform, as if it were shutting down unnecessary systems just to survive the monotony. Physiologically, this state mirrors the symptoms of trauma: increased cortisol levels, disrupted sleep cycles, and elevated heart rate variability. But the effects extend deeper, into perception itself. After weeks of silence, many inmates report seeing shadows that aren't there or hearing voices from their past. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, 2023, found that these hallucinations are not rare, they're expected. According to their report, over 50% of isolated inmates develop some form of psychotic or depressive symptom within the first 3 months. Suicidal thoughts and self-harm attempts become alarmingly frequent. In one documented case cited by Human Rights Watch, 2008, a prisoner began cutting into his own flesh, not from anger, but simply to feel something. Anything. The human brain is designed for connection. remove it long enough, and it begins to deteriorate, much like a muscle wasting away without movement. Cognitive dysfunction becomes the next stage. The NIJ grant 232973 documented inmates losing their ability to plan, focus, or remember basic routines. One participant described forgetting how to read after years of isolation, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his mind had no reason to engage. Experts call this identity erosion, a gradual disintegration of the self. The brain, deprived of interaction and stimulation, loses its reference points. Who you are, what you believe, what's real. By the time many are released back into the general population or society, their minds no longer function as they once did. They have survived the box, but not without leaving pieces of themselves inside it. Harvard Law Review, 2015, referred to this condition as psychological annihilation, the destruction of mental integrity while leaving the body untouched. The human experiment. For decades, America's Supermax prisons have operated under one principle: control through isolation. But behind the reinforced doors and surveillance cameras, another reality unfolds. To many experts, Supermax confinement has become the largest uncontrolled psychological experiment ever conducted on human beings. When ADX Florence opened in 1994, it was described as the most secure prison in the world. Every detail, from the soundproof cells to the windowless corridors, was designed to prevent contact, escape, or rebellion. But as years passed, psychologists began noticing a different kind of casualty. Inside those cells, prisoners began to unravel. Some screamed for hours, others refused to speak at all. One inmate, interviewed anonymously by Human Rights Watch, said, "After a while, you stop believing you exist. You start wondering if you died a long time ago." According to the NIJ Grant 232973, these aren't isolated incidents, they're predictable outcomes. The brain's need for social feedback is so fundamental that removing it causes the same neural pain as physical injury. It's not metaphorical. MRI scans show that the same brain regions light up under social rejection as when a person experiences bodily harm. That's why Harvard Law Review, 2015, labeled long-term isolation a form of psychological torture. Not because it leaves scars, but because it erases the self without a single mark. The Human Rights Watch 2008 report documented inmates who began eating their own waste, smearing words on the walls, or mutilating themselves in confusion. In the most severe cases, guards reported individuals who had forgotten how to speak after years of silence. Every incident reads less like a disciplinary record and more like a descent into madness. And yet, despite decades of data, Supermax facilities continue to operate. Inmates can spend 10, 15, even 20 years in total isolation, many without any clear path back to normal housing. The Frontiers in Psychiatry, 2020, study called this institutionalized psychological decay, a system that reproduces mental illness faster than it rehabilitates it. The most haunting revelation, however, is that many of those most affected were already mentally ill before they ever arrived. The Human Rights Watch report estimated that over 1/3 of Supermax prisoners suffered from diagnosed psychiatric conditions prior to isolation. Once inside, their conditions worsened dramatically. In some states, lawsuits forced officials to admit what many already knew, that solitary confinement is not a disciplinary tool anymore. It's a human experiment that continues to unfold, cell by cell, unseen by the public eye. The collapse of self. In the beginning, isolation feels like punishment. Over time, it becomes something far more devastating, a slow dismantling of identity itself. Psychologists call it the collapse of self. It's not a metaphor. It's the point where the mind can no longer distinguish between existing and disappearing. The Frontiers in Psychiatry, 2020, analysis describes this stage as the terminal phase of solitary confinement's psychological impact. Prisoners begin to experience disassociation, a detachment from reality, emotions, and even their own bodies. One inmate in the study described feeling as if he were watching himself from outside his skin. Cognitive function deteriorates. The NIJ research documented how inmates start forgetting faces, routines, even language. Without human interaction to anchor their sense of self, they drift between consciousness and a hollow, waking dream. Those who enter isolation with pre-existing mental illness often spiral beyond recovery. The Human Rights Watch 2008 report found that inmates with schizophrenia or severe depression deteriorate faster than any other group. Delusions intensify, and paranoia takes over. Some become violent, not out of hatred but confusion, striking out at the walls, the guards, or themselves. The National Alliance on Mental Illness 2023 warned that solitary confinement amplifies psychiatric symptoms to lethal levels. Suicides among isolated inmates occur at rates several times higher than in the general prison population. NAMI's report included case after case of prisoners who took their lives within days of being placed in isolation. One particularly chilling statistic. In California, though inmates in solitary made up less than 10% of the prison population, they accounted for nearly half of all suicides. Harvard Law Review called this cruelty by design. Because the suffering isn't accidental, it's built into the structure itself. Supermax prisons, they argue, don't just restrict behavior. They erase humanity. When the courts began reviewing these cases, they faced a moral and legal dilemma. Does extreme isolation violate the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment? In 2015, Justice Anthony Kennedy addressed the issue in a landmark opinion, acknowledging that solitary confinement causes a human toll that will bring us to reconsider the necessities of its use. But change has been slow. Even with lawsuits, documentaries, and public outrage, thousands remain inside Supermax cells today, invisible, unheard, and unraveling one day at a time. The collapse of self is not loud. It doesn't happen with screaming or violence. It happens quietly, in the silence between a man and his own thoughts, until even those thoughts begin to fade. The debate and the future. For years, the public barely knew what life inside a Supermax cell truly looked like. The walls kept the noise in, and the truth out. But today, that silence is beginning to crack. Across the United States, a growing coalition of psychologists, lawmakers, and human rights advocates are challenging the very foundation of Supermax confinement. Their message is simple: isolation on this scale is not correction, it's destruction. The Harvard Law Review, 2015, argues that long-term solitary confinement meets the legal threshold for psychological torture. It's not a question of morality alone, it's a question of constitutionality. When a punishment systematically dismantles mental health, they write, it ceases to serve justice and begins to violate it. Internationally, that argument has already gained traction. The United Nations Mandela Rules, adopted in 2015, explicitly define solitary confinement beyond 15 days as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. By those standards, many U.S. Supermax practices would be considered a violation of human rights. Even within America's justice system, reform is gaining ground. Several states, including Colorado, New York, and Maine, have begun phasing out long-term isolation, citing the overwhelming evidence of psychological harm. Colorado's former corrections chief, Rick Ramish, made headlines when he voluntarily spent 20 hours inside a solitary cell. Afterward, he wrote that it felt like being buried alive. Within a year, he reduced the state's use of solitary confinement by over 80%. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, 2023, continues to push for federal limits, emphasizing that the current system worsens the very mental health crises it claims to manage. Their position is clear: rehabilitation and psychological torture cannot coexist. Still, the debate remains divided. Prison officials argue that isolation is necessary to control violent or high-risk inmates. For them, it's a matter of safety, not cruelty. But critics counter that decades of research, including the Frontiers in Psychiatry, 2020 meta-analysis, prove that solitary confinement does not deter violence. It fuels it. Each year, more data emerges, and each statistic tells the same story. Isolation does not correct behavior. It corrodes the human mind. And when those same minds eventually return to society, the damage doesn't stay behind the walls. The future of Supermax prisons will likely depend on how this generation chooses to interpret justice. Is it about control or correction? About punishment or humanity? One truth remains certain. The debate over solitary confinement isn't just about the inmates locked inside those cells. It's about who we become when we allow the silence of those walls to define justice itself. Echoes beyond the walls. When the steel door finally opens, and an inmate walks out of a Supermax cell, freedom doesn't always follow. For many, the confinement never truly ends, it simply changes shape. Psychologists describe this as post-isolation syndrome, a collection of long-term psychological effects that linger long after release. Anxiety, hypervigilance, paranoia. Simple human contact feels overwhelming. A knock on the door, a crowded street, or even eye contact can trigger panic. The NIJ research study, Grant 232973, documented these lingering effects among inmates transferred from Supermax units back into general population. Many struggled to reintegrate. They avoided conversation, distrusted others, and reacted violently to sudden noise or touch. Decades of isolation had rewired their survival instincts. They no longer lived with people, only around them. In interviews collected by Human Rights Watch, one former inmate described stepping into society after years in isolation. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't walk into a store. I didn't know how to be a person anymore. The Frontiers in Psychiatry, 2020, meta-analysis supports this testimony with stark data. Even after reintegration, cognitive performance and emotional regulation remain significantly impaired. Many former prisoners report depression, hallucinations, and chronic insomnia years after release. This is the part the public rarely sees, the invisible aftermath. Isolation may have kept the system quiet, but it left countless minds shattered in silence. For families, the reunion often feels like meeting a stranger. Loved ones return home physically present but emotionally distant, locked inside a different kind of cell, the one built by their own trauma. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, 2023, warns that the ripple effects of solitary confinement extend far beyond prison walls. When men and women return home carrying untreated psychological damage, communities inherit that pain. It becomes a cycle, isolation creating instability, instability creating new reasons for isolation. And yet, amid the devastation, some survivors find meaning in survival itself. A few former inmates now speak publicly, pushing for change. Their voices, once silenced in the box, are reshaping the national conversation about punishment and humanity. As one advocate put it, "They thought isolation would break me. What it did was teach me how fragile the mind really is, and how much we need each other to stay human." In the end, the story of Supermax prisons is not just about crime or punishment. It's about what happens when society builds a place where time, identity, and connection are stripped away, and then dares to see what's left. The echoes of that silence don't stop at the prison gate. They follow us, asking one haunting question. If breaking a person's mind keeps the rest of us safe, what does that say about the kind of world we're protecting? The walls of a Supermax prison were built to contain danger, but in doing so, they revealed something even darker about human nature. When isolation becomes policy, and silence becomes justice, we are forced to ask not just what we're doing to prisoners, but what we're doing to ourselves. Across the world, nations are beginning to question the cost of this kind of control. Neuroscience, law, and morality are converging on one truth: no mind can survive total isolation unchanged. And maybe that's the lesson Supermax prisons were never meant to teach, that breaking a person's spirit doesn't make society stronger. It just makes us colder. If this story made you think, remember, awareness is the first step toward change. Share this video so more people can understand what truly happens inside these walls. Comment your thoughts below. Do you believe solitary confinement still has a place in modern justice? And if you want more real stories like this, stories that explore the darkest corners of the prison system and the resilience of the human mind, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. because in the next story, we go even deeper into the prisons the world forgot and the people who refuse to disappear inside them.